welcome back to the 15th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of September 21st, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast. And I am excited that we have an extremely difficult gospel text this week. It's one of those that's not necessarily the easiest to talk about. It's not necessarily one that I think a lot of people are going to say, this is my favorite passage of Scripture. There are certain aspects of it that we quote quite often, but it's still a very difficult text to go through and to think about and to contemplate. And I think the tie-in what we'll get to this week, I think kind of shows the contrast a little bit of what Jesus was getting at in the text in and of itself. But before we get there, we got to look back to the question that we had for last week, which was, where are you going to grow with new ideas? And we had some great responses, people trying some different things, people doing different things and having to learn from them. I know for myself, one of the things that's been very hard right now is, as I've mentioned, I'm training to do a half marathon, and part of that training means you need to get in a lot of miles. Well, as I've been doing that, I've been battling a few different minor injuries, and I've had some calf strain issues. I've had now a fairly decent rolled ankle issue. And as you can probably hear a little bit in my voice, I've been now battling a little bit of a flu bug and trying to have all three of those, figuring out how much rest do I really need, figuring out then when can I actually start running, feeling good about it and recognizing that I'm not going to be at the level that I was prior, and knowing that my half marathon that I'm doing is getting closer and closer, and trying to figure that all out and recognizing that there is an aspect of this that even though I've done running before, there's a lot of new things that I'm trying to figure out all at once. And yes, it's overwhelming, but it's also trusting my body, trusting time, trusting the healing process to allow myself to be able to accomplish what we're needing to accomplish. And I think sometimes that means going against what I would want to do. This is a new idea where at times where it's like, I have to take a week off. My body physically isn't letting me able to do this. You try running, it's not all the way back. I still need more time. And as much as I would like to get out there, I have to allow my body to recover. And I think sometimes we within our faith and how we think about it and how we talk about it, we need to be able to understand that it's the same type of thing. We have to be able to recognize and grow within our faith and how we move forward, and allowing ourselves that possibility. And sometimes that growing doesn't happen nearly as quickly as we would like. So let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts this week is from Jeremiah chapter 8, starting at verse 18 to chapter 9, verse 1. This is one of the texts where we get the idea of the weeping prophet of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is just sad on what has happened to different people of the tribe of Israel, and how they've just been taken away from where God is trying to steer them. That they have been, if you want to say, distracted by foreign idols, or just not being able to continue on that path of trust and working on that relationship with God. And we hear this a little bit in verse 22. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician here? Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? The idea of how these people then have left God or gone in a different path, and why hasn't this been restored? Why is this pain so hard? This recognition on how walking in the faith is this difficult thing sometimes, as we watch people that, yes, it's a community thing, but it's also an individual thing. And sometimes individual choices that others make within the community affect all of us. And sometimes we wish they were different, and yet that can be very difficult moving forward as well. The psalm with that is Psalm 79, the first 9 verses of that. And it's the recognition again on how we as the people of Israel have inherited so much. We are the chosen people of God, and how God has continued to bless the people and making sure that they are provided for, but yet we still struggle with that. And in this moment here, there is discussion about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then the people then are kind of going back to, God, then why are you still having us go through these trials and tribulations? How long? Are you going to be angry forever? Coming from verse 5. This recognition on how sometimes our own personal feelings and stuff get involved within that, and we lose sight of what God has continued to provide. But yet we need to continue to steer our eyes toward God and recognize, even in the hardships, even in the hard times, God is still in control and God still got this. We just need to continue to trust and not necessarily always be ridiculing God. Yes, there is a time to complain and a time to say, why God, why? But yet also not getting stuck there at the same moment. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of Amos chapter 8, verses 4-7. This is one of those moments where Amos is calling out some of the different people in the town where they're looking forward to different celebrations being over, looking forward to the Sabbath being over, looking for opportunities to continue to make money and through practices that aren't necessarily the best practices. So he kind of is referencing here this idea of being able to get wheat and taking and moving in some of the additional chaff that they know there to make the weights heavier so that they thus get more money for not as good of a product, and looking for these ways to make sure that they are collecting as much money as they can and looking at it as this, the Sabbath is here. It's an opportunity that I can't make money, instead of recognizing the gifts that God has given them. And it is forcing them to ignore the needy. Instead is more worried about their own pocketbooks. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 113, all 9 verses of it. And this continues along that same theme on how we have to be looking and utilizing ourselves as gifts to other people. And that means that we are lifting up those who are in positions that aren't as good as what we would like them to be. We are recognizing that just because they are perceived socially as a lower class or in a different bracket, or maybe they're struggling to make ends meet, does not mean that we ignore them. Instead, that we recognize them and lift them up, and recognizing in that we are working together as the body of Christ, that this is something that we are all a part of, and recognizing that it's all of us working together to bring the name of who God is to people. And the way of doing that is recognizing and welcoming people in and making sure that you are a help to those who need help. The epistle text or second reading then is from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1-7. And this then kind of continues along that same theme, but then acknowledging that if you have people who are in higher positions than you, so in this case would be kings, but also a lot of government leaders and things of that nature, making sure that we are praying for them and acknowledging and asking God to be in guidance positions to make sure that they are making good decisions. But that doesn't give us something that separates us. This is something for us to be doing as part of our reflection of Christ within us and showing that to other people, but then also looking for ways for us to continue to be working and helping other people around us. This idea of us seeing the gifts of what we've been given, giving thanks for them, and utilizing those gifts. If there are people that we recognize that are able to give gifts that we can't give, making sure that we are giving thanks to that as well. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 16, the first 13 verses of it. And I'd argue that I don't think this is necessarily anyone's favorite Bible passage, but it's this parable that Jesus tells his disciples that there's a rich man who is a manager and finds that the manager has been squandering his property, according to him, and he wants his books. And the manager then starts scrambling because he realizes that, one, he's can't do other things. He's in this elevated position and he's not strong enough to dig, and he's too ashamed to beg. So what does he do? He looks to the debtors who are still on the sheets and then starts thinking of ways, how can I be perceived better by other people? What if I start forgiving debts without talking to the landowner themselves and start slashing prices on what they're doing? And Jesus then kind of gets into this idea of what does this actually do for him? He is getting treasures by other people. They're perceiving him good by dishonest ways of doing it. So he has made headway with people through dishonorable ways of creating wealth. So what is that actually going to get him? And it gets back to this idea then, whoever is faithful with very little is also faithful in much. And whoever is dishonest with very little is also dishonest with very much, coming from verse 10. This idea and recognition on how we can't be, as we get into verse 13, a slave that serves two masters, which is both God and wealth and money. This idea of how God utilizes that, but it's which one is the priority in your life, and making sure that God stays in that number one priority and not letting wealth overtake it. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between the Sermon Brainwaves podcast or commentaries or discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, directions, ways to be thinking about these texts in a new and creative way. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, making it easier for me to be able to go through the text every week with you guys. But I also really enjoy how they have art, prayers, hymns, different daily readings to help prepare you for the week upcoming and just get you in that mindset and being able to then take more out of that worship service because you have been thinking about this and pondering this more and more. I think it's something within our own faith that we don't talk about enough, and it really is helpful. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. It's either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies within the weekly lectionary like we do here, along with going through some different events and additional resources. If you enjoy listening to me talk about faith and science every week, if you have an ecological lens, I know you're going to enjoy these publications over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications, and that'll be the first link down in the show notes. There is one thing when I was working through with someone going through these texts and thinking about that they pointed out that I think is really important for us to think about. And it's the manager going through after recognizing that he is going to get fired. He thinks shrewdly and figures out, what am I going to do so that others perceive me well? And where we find that in verse 8, where the landowner had fired this guy for being dishonest. And what does he do? He figures out a way to look good among other people shrewdly, quickly, easily, and is able to potentially line his own pockets as he's figuring out what he is going to do next. It's very easy for us often to think of ways to potentially benefit us. And it's sometimes really difficult as we look through these texts this week, thinking about others, whether it is people who are above us and praying for them, or in a democracy, voicing our opinions in a respectful way to making sure that they can help make the best decisions possible and trusting their decision process, or also making us available to those who are not doing well and recognizing and figuring out that God has given us abilities and capabilities to be able to help some of these different people, and finding ways to be able to be a help and a way to let our faith be shown to other people around us, that it's something that is very active and is part of who we are, not just something that we talk about. And I think there is a really good example that I ran across in the last few weeks. And I think in order for us to do that, we need to go through and learn a little bit about a camera company and how that influences thinking shrewdly. So let's get into it a little bit. First, we're going to talk about Leica cameras. And if you haven't heard of Leica cameras, they're a German camera maker, and they have a very interesting history. Initially, they were known as the Leitz Camera Company, and they were known for Ernst Leitz, who had initially worked with a company working with microscopes and then was taking that technology and going into optics and kind of continuing on his own. In that, they had this worker that they had within their factory called Oscar Barnack, and he decided to try working with figuring out a camera per se. And there's two different theories on what was going on here. One is that Oscar was a hiker and apparently had asthma. And so he wanted something to be able to bring with him to be able to potentially do landscape photography that was easy to carry. Now we got to remember, cameras at this point, and where we're talking about here is about early 1900s, because the first prototype comes out in 1914. But cameras is more of a hobbyist thing. It's not necessarily a big production, and we had a lot of billows, and it was just a big, heavy production to be able to take a photograph at this point. The other thing that is theorized is potentially Oscar Barnack was, because of the film that he ends up doing, which he's the end up being the person to bring 35 millimeter film, which if you're an older generation, you know how that was the point and shoot cameras. Everybody used 35 millimeter film. He was taking that film, which was being used vertically for movies, and turned it horizontal so that there was actually more film that was actually going to be able to be utilized. And some of the idea was potentially to help with range finding and potentially helping with framing up movie productions in a simple way before you started running the film. And especially with how they were running film at that point to create movies was fast and quick. And so it would be very easy to create a rangefinder, or essentially a test photo, to be able to recognize what is in frame. So Oscar Barnack comes up with this original prototype in 1914. But as long as we know history, and like we talked about, he's rotated things and he's making the 2:3 ratio, but this is a rough time for this to be kind of coming out. We have World War I right on the horizon. And so thus it kind of gets pushed to the side for a while. And after World War I, it took a while for things to kind of get up. And again, you have a business that's working well. It's making optics. This is a side project. And so they did some iterations. And in 1924, 1925, we have the original Leica 1 come out, which then is followed by the 2 and by the 3. And the 2 and the 3, especially, one of the things that was very unique is instead of having a fixed focal length or a camera that only would shoot one focal length, they had figured out, because of their optics, that they had ways to remove the camera lens and put it on, and thus being able to have actually a variety of focal lengths. And this is one of the big things that was moving Leica forward. But as we move into the 30s, as we know, especially being a German company, tensions rose as you continue to go through the 30s, to especially in the late 30s, we had some different issues that arose. And this is where we get some really interesting history. And that is with the owner, Ernst Leitz II, who is running it. And he's the one who initially even got this camera stuff going. His one famous quote is, "My decision is final. We'll take the risk." The idea that we are going to take the risk with doing the camera initially. Well, what has been also very fascinating with this man is that he did some things that were very unconventional for the time and did them very quietly. So one of the things that Ernst Leitz II did is, within Leica camera, his father had originally started this, and thus they changed the name to Leica, Leitz, and then camera, so Leica. And in doing that, they also then had this idea of, our coworkers we treat extremely well, no matter what. We want to take care of our workers. And especially after the Night of Broken Glass, where you started to have Jewish empathy within the Nazi party starting to rise, there was a lot of questions on what's going on. And this is one of the moments that Ernst Leitz II did something that was a little bit covert. And there's questions on whether or not the Nazi party knew this or not. The Nazis couldn't really do anything. So let's get to the heart of this. Leica, because of their optics, were known very well, and the Nazi party contracted with Leica to be able to produce cameras specifically for the Air Force so that they were able to do surveillance with taking photographs of what's going on, positioning, and things of that nature. And this was a major thing. And Leitz, it sounds like, as we were kind of looking at things, was kind of pushed into this, whether he liked to be or not, especially with being a German company. And this is something that the Germans were needing and what was being decided. But again, after the Night of Broken Glass, and you're having the tensions arise specifically within Jewish people in Germany, Leitz did something that he didn't talk about. He started purposely hiring and working with hiring people of the Jewish faith, training them and moving them to other places. And he could argue it fairly well. They were training them and then moving them to other places, to the different branches, if you want to consider it that way. Often also sending them with Leica cameras, so it was a easy publicity. And Leica cameras then were also very well known within reporters and photographing a lot of the war. A lot of it was done on Leica cameras. And again, with sending then these Jews to different places, a lot of them also to the United States, you were having your camera getting there, you were able to advertise it, and you were also taking them out of this area of high risk for them. What ended up being a quote that he is quoted on stating, I guess, in more private circles is, "Do good, but don't talk about it." To the point where when there were reporters who went and talked to Ernst Leitz III about this and wanted to publish a story about this, Ernst Leitz III didn't want to talk about it. He said, "I don't want this published." It was very much this idea of, this is something that I'm doing to take care of other people, and this is something that doesn't need to be pushed. This is something that we just did to take care of people. I find that a really interesting, and it's kind of the opposite of the landowner that we have here this week. Instead of getting consumed and figuring out, yes, there could have been ways to easily make it so that potentially Leica could have even profited more by getting even closer within the Nazi regime, they recognized that there was still people who were being taken advantage of. And instead, recognizing their position, recognizing their ability, they figured out a shrewd way to be able to help them, where it was the Leica Freedom Train. And the exact number of people that they helped, they are not sure of, because again, how covert a lot of ways this was, but it's in the hundreds, at least, of people that they were able to help way doing this. And there's questions if the Nazi Party had potentially people in and amongst and were knowing what was going on, but also the Germans couldn't do anything. They were dependent on Leica. They needed those cameras for their work to do the surveillance. I think of it today, we're in an interesting position the same way with our environment. We recognize that there is a lot of different things in which we're doing that is hurting the environment. And at what point are we going to be shrewdly working on this? Are we going to shrewdly work on this from a positive aspect and work to make sure that everyone gets a fair share, even if it means reducing how much, especially me as an American, is consuming things? Or am I going to elevate myself above and I'm suddenly acting like a shrewd manager and saying, I somehow am in this position of power, so thus I need to get everything out of it that I can? I think that's one of the things right now that I'm watching more and more happen, I feel like, in our world, is that we are more and more concerned about getting every little bit out of something, instead of recognizing that there's sometimes a beauty to not, because then by not getting everything out, it actually opens the door to actually give. It opens the door to being able to help those who aren't doing as well, because it's like, you know what, there's more than enough here. And we've purposely left a little bit open here. Take this, do this, instead of trying to squeeze every single drop out of the lemon. And that takes a lot of wisdom to know, when is there more there that we should be trying to get out? And when is it too much that we're putting in a lot of work to not get a lot out, and it's actually damaging to what we're trying to create? I know one of the things, that I won't get into it, but I'll attach some links down below. That's one of the things, especially the Chicago Cubs, for instance, are running after. They have figured out ways to control the rooftops around all but one. And there's now court documents and filings and all this, and there's questions on, even money-wise, is it worth it? But it's also the aspect of, do we want a corporate entity controlling everything? Or is there room for independent players to be able to be part of that as well? And it's something that I think in our world we are wrestling with. Do we want big things controlling everything? Or do we allow for us to care for others? And I think sometimes, yes, when we are able to consolidate and have something big, is if it's in the core mission, you can give a lot out of that. But it's also very easy for us to get greedy as well and just say we need more and more and more. And when we look at a lot of the environmental crisis and different things of that nature that we've talked about plenty of times in this podcast, I feel like that's kind of where we're at. We're in this place of how can I get more and more out of this? How can the world give me more and more? And when do we ever go back to God and give thanks and say, thank you, God, but I have pulled enough? I think especially when we are thinking about wealth in that way, I think it's easy for us to go back to the manna and quails when the Israelites are wandering around in the desert and they are told to get just enough for what they need right now, or at most getting enough for one additional day for the Sabbath, getting the 2 days food. But if they got more than that, it's spoiled and they had maggots in their tents. What would our world look like if we honestly just worried about making sure that each of us had enough? What would our world look like if we were thinking about it that way and noticing the people who didn't have enough and making sure that they had enough? What would our world look like financially with making sure people were paid equitably, making sure that people were paid enough to have enough? What would our world look like then? I think is a great question. Money can really derail things. Money sometimes can cause us to lose focus, whether we have a lot of it or not. It can really be a proponent to drive us to do things we otherwise wouldn't do. And I think that's something that we need to contemplate and consider. It's not the root of all evil, but it can lead us to a root of evil. If we never stop to give thanks, if we never stop to recognize, if we never stop and think about others, I think we have missed the point. And like we were talked about in 1 Timothy, how are we able then to actually see our faith in action? We can talk about it all we want, but if our faith isn't actually doing something and caring for people and looking out for others, that we are able to actively show our faith without saying a word, what are we actually doing? How much does our faith actually mean to us then? Are we just constantly thinking of shrewd ways to make sure that we have enough or more than enough or make an extra penny or two? Are we any better than the people that Amos is talking about, where they're worrying about ways to tip the scales so that they can get a little bit of additional income more than what their person who is getting it is expecting? There's working shrewdly for good and there's working shrewdly for yourself. And I think that's one of the things as a world we need to keep thinking about, because I think it also needs to go beyond humankind. If we're constantly thinking shrewdly for humans, I think sometimes we miss the point of what God has created for us to be able to all enjoy, human and non-human. And so sometimes that means leaving enough behind for others, leaving behind enough for something else outside of even human consumption to be able to enjoy. That means not getting every ounce out. That means not being 100% efficient and being okay with that. And I think that's a message and something that as a world we need to get our heads around and get around quickly. Because if we don't, I think we're going to really struggle to have our world be productive. Because we're going to continue to take all the resources that we can until there's nothing left. And then what? We have then squandered what God has given us to manage. And we're no better than the fired manager. And so what are we going to do? Sell it off to each other? It doesn't do anything. So the question I have for you this week is, where do we need to become less efficient? Where do we need to become less efficient? And the reason I say that is with, again, like we've stated, with being less efficient, I sometimes think that it opens the door for us to actually give more. I think it opens the door for us to notice the needs of others more. And so if we are not as consumed with getting our productivity to these super high levels, are we then able to open our eyes more to those who actually might need our help more? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And I think that's something as a world we need to remember. We are only as strong as our weakest link. And so thus, we need to take care of each other to strengthen all of our links together. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.